does philosophy support the existence of God? Now we're kind of getting down to a fundamental question that probably has been settled in most of our lives, most of the folks in here for sure, and that is the question is, does God actually exist? Now there are people who are struggling with that, particularly in this day and age where they hear lots of different, a lot of different information that might, I mean, you got guys like Stephen Hawking saying there's no God, and Richard Dawkins, and all these people running around talking about God really does not exist. But we're going to look at what philosophy says about it, and we're going to try to determine if philosophy does conclude that there is a God or the possibility of a God. What about that God? Is he the God that we study and worship and think about, or is he some other God? So we're going to go through the philosophical arguments that have been raised for thousands of years, actually. It's been talked about ever since, I guess, ever since man could sit down over a cup of coffee and talk to one another. This question has been discussed. Now, we're going to rewind for a second. Last week we discovered that a guy living in the not the Iron Age, not the Stone Age, the Iron Age, spoke 10 words that only recently have been discovered to be right. This fellow's name was Moses. 3,500 years ago, he said, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Long before any scientist was ever born, long before any scientific terminology, instruments of science were ever created. Now this discovery, as I told you last week, has been called the greatest scientific discovery in the history of mankind, that the universe had a beginning. Prior to that, philosophers and scientists really believed that the universe was infinitely old and infinite in size, and therefore it needed no creator. Now, with the help of a fellow named Albert Einstein, who was a secular Jew, he is actually an atheist when he made this discovery. Later on, he admitted that there had to be some sort of supreme intellect out there. He never became a Christian or any kind of a practicing Jew. But he and George Lemaitre and Edwin Hubble all concluded that there was a beginning to the universe, the greatest scientific discovery in the history of mankind. And guess what? They get credit for that. And yet this shepherd out in the deserts of Egypt and Saudi Arabia said these words 3,500 years ago. So, you know, go figure, okay? The Bible starts out, some people say, well, the Bible's not a science book. The first 3 words in the scriptures articulate the greatest scientific discovery in the history of mankind. And I think that's pretty astonishing. But we're going to find out more about that later on. Tonight we're going to talk about philosophy and see what these philosophers conclude about God. Tonight we will step away from the world of science into the world of philosophy. So what is philosophy to begin with? That'd be a good thing to talk about for a second. Philosophy is the systematic examination of ideas and concepts. And when I say systematic, I mean that there are rules associated with it. There's rules of logic, there's rules of reason. Philosophy is a discipline. You just can't go and say anything and it be acceptable in philosophy. It has to follow rules. There's laws of the law of non-contradiction that we're going to talk about. I mean, somebody can't say, I'm a married bachelor, for instance. That doesn't make any sense. That's the law of non-contradiction. But unlike science, philosophy is not limited to the natural world. So it's a discipline that encompasses the natural world, but it extends beyond the natural world. You can talk about anything. You can talk about things outside the natural world. Now, the concept of a god or gods, and with a little g, because there's a lot of those out there, as you all know, exists in every culture on the face of the earth. Just about every culture that you can come up with has some sort of god or gods that they worship. Over in India, for instance, it's gods. You know, they're called pantheists. Everything is a god. So you have to be very careful where you sit over there. Now, and the fact that so many societies have concluded independently that there is a God has caused these great thinkers to consider the question of the existence of God. One philosophical argument that we're not going to spend any time on is the fact that since there's a belief in widespread religion and a following of widespread religion, then there's this thing called the argument from desire. If people desire it, it must exist, you know, because why would you desire you know, what created this desire? And it's a weak argument, but it's out there anyway. Now, guys like Aristotle, back in the 4th century BC, and his buddy Plato talked about this, the existence of God, even back before Christ was born. In the Middle Ages, is Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And later came Descartes, the Frenchman, and Kant, the German, during the years of the Enlightenment in Europe. And then more recently, in the 20th century, you had Nietzsche, who declared that God is dead. He's the guy that came up with that. And Freud. Now, how could the existence of God be proven? Can't be proven, but how could it be substantiated philosophically? What could we say philosophically that make us feel good about the existence or not about the existence of God? Good or bad? Because the arguments fall on both sides, as you know. Now, the classical arguments for and against God are commonly called the ontological argument, which we're going to talk about, and I'll teach you what ontology is. Kind of a weird concept. The first cause argument, the argument from design, and the moral law argument, or the moral argument, which you will immediately recognize, I think. Now, these arguments will be presented along with the common objections to them. And then you can think about, well, here's the argument and here's the objection to it. But hopefully this will give us some insight into the philosophy of God and whether or not He exists or not. Now, immediately a dilemma arises. So what if we conclude philosophically that there is a God? Now, what God are we talking about? Are we talking about the Hindus' idea of God, or the Islam idea of a God? What God are we talking about? The Christian idea of a God? The Jewish idea of a God? Which one? So as we go down through these philosophical arguments, what I've done, I've arranged them in a way that we can talk about what gods do they eliminate? You know, what gods are still in the game? And when we get to the last one, we should be able to say, well, if God exists, then this is the only one that all of these arguments support. Does that make sense to you? Now, so our guide must be that the one true God, or gods must be supported by a successful philosophical argument and other evidences, which we will get into in weeks to come. What are the scientific, the historical evidences that support this philosophical understanding of God? The first philosophical argument I'm going to cover is called the ontological argument. Now, in general, ontology is the study of the existence or being, what entities exist in the universe. And you usually, in fact, I can't remember, but a couple of times where I've ever heard the term ontology used in any other way except in the discussion about God. Does God exist? So it's a pretty narrow focus. And unlike some of the other arguments that we're going to talk about tonight, the subject of existence or being doesn't need any proof at all. It's simply reason. What people, great thinkers like the ones I've talked about, have said about the existence of God, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. Based on reasons only and needing no physical evidence to prove that there's a God. Let me back up 1 second though and say this, because this is the people that are trying to prove that God does not exist are at a disadvantage. And the reason they are is because it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. You can't prove that something doesn't exist because no rules apply to that. Something doesn't exist, you can't say, well, this, and this about it because it doesn't exist. On the other hand, if you are a believer in God, it's completely your responsibility to prove that God exists. Now, you can prove that something exists. I heard somebody say one time, well, I can prove something doesn't exist. And I said, well, okay, do it. And he said, I got an empty box here. And I look at it and I say, there's no rocks in that box. There's no rocks existing in that box. So there you go. I said, well, there may be rocks somewhere else. You know, all you've proven is they do not exist in this space and the space-time place here. So, to prove something doesn't exist is philosophically impossible to do. But they never quit trying. Now, an ontological God is one that is intuitively known, okay? One ancient philosopher said, I know the answer without leaving my couch, no problem for me. We're going to see how strong an argument that can be. The fact that mankind seeks a perfect God is plenty of evidence for some people. If we can conceive of Him and that nothing greater can exist or more perfect, then He must exist. And y'all bear with me now, because this is what's called an a priori argument. It's a statement that has to be taken as said. It's a given, okay? And of course, if you've got people on the other side of the issue, they're not going to let that stand. Essentially, the ontological argument proposes that the existence of God is a self-evident truth. That's my favorite way of describing an ontological God, a self-evident truth. You remember where that term is used? It's in the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, we don't have to discuss them. We don't have to debate them. That all men are created equal is obvious. There's no point in discussing that. That's kind of an ontological argument in a way. So what I would advise you, if you ever hear this or want to explain it, just say that the ontological argument is that God is a self-evident truth. We just know He exists because we can't conceive of Him not existing. Descartes, the Frenchman, said, certainly the idea of a God or a supreme being is one that I find within me just as surely as the idea of any shape or number. In other words, it's impossible for him not to conceive of God. Now, here's one of the things that for many years the ontological argument had no evidence or proof, and really this is the first time I think it's been said that there may be some proof for it. Because the ontological argument states or claims that God's existence is necessary and that no other greater being could ever be imagined. In other words, this being is necessary and He's perfect. And up until just recently, people would say things like, well, the folks arguing on the other side that says no thing is absolutely necessary. We could live without anything. But think about this for a second. We know the universe had a beginning now. We know it from the scriptures, we know it from the scientific journals. And it came about somehow. There was some necessary being that made that universe come about. The Big Bang. Because something cannot come from nothing. There's no such thing as self-creation. So there was something necessary prior to the Big Bang, the expanding universe cosmology model, that had to be there. So I think that if you believe that God created the universe, as Moses did, then it makes, it's kind of proof or a suggestion of a proof that God was necessary. Now, as you might imagine, there are some strong objections to the ontological argument. And actually, the objectors are on both sides of the aisle, the theist and atheist. Immanuel Kant, who was a theist, he was actually a bishop or some position in the church, argued that existence is never necessary. So he's one of the guys that's doing just what I told you. He says, nothing is absolutely necessary. But if the ontological argument is accepted, which is up to you, it says then that there must be the case that a perfect and necessary being exists. Okay, a perfect and necessary being exists. Now I think that this argument does very little to prove the existence of God. It's almost a personal opinion. Even though a self-evident truth there's a lot of people on this planet that would agree with that. But as far as something hard that you can count on, the ontological argument doesn't do much for us. And it actually leaves a lot of space for other gods, lots of gods. Because the people in India say, yeah, I believe there's a God, but it's that bull over there, that cow is a god. So it really doesn't narrow things down very much as to if God exists, which God are we talking about? On the other hand, it's no weaker than the objections that are thrown up against it. It doesn't prove that God does not exist. So, it's kind of neutral in my mind. It's not something that I personally would run out and say, I've got the answer. Here I can philosophically argue that there is a God. But it doesn't do any harm. And the part about the God being necessary, we'll develop that a little more as we go along. Now, the next argument is called the first cause argument. Now we're going to start to put some meat on these bones, okay? The first cause argument is also called the cosmological argument. Now, and it states that the universe, which we know for certain exists, right? Anybody in here thinks the universe does not exist? Okay, so we're pretty much in agreement that this universe we're in exists. Now, some people say there's trillions of other universes, and we will one day talk about that. And that this existing universe actually had a beginning. Now, for many, many, many years, they argued, the folks believing in God argued that from a very poor position, because philosophically and scientifically, people thought the universe never had a beginning, that it was infinite. It's just been in the last 85 years, as you found out last week, that science says, uh-oh, there was a beginning. We got, astrophysics and physics have a big problem. We basically have to start over. I mean, it's difficult to overstate how big a problem this was in the scientific community. Not only a philosophical problem of enormous proportions, because historically about 60% of scientists have been agnostic or atheist. And by the way, that number hasn't changed a lot. Some people get thinking that all scientists are atheists. Well, that's not true. I've met a lot of scientists, I'm one, and I've met a lot more, and I'm talking about, high-level scientists that are just as dedicated to Christ as anybody you would ever know. And they believe in God, mainly because they're science. It's strange to think about. Why are they atheists and then they're Christians and they're looking at the same data? Now, they believe the first cause argument says there was a beginning of the universe, and that beginning was necessarily caused, which is where it gets its name, I guess, the first cause. Now, the first cause argument seeks to establish the existence of a creator who created the universe and everything that is in it for some purpose. Okay. Now, the idea of a first cause has been around a long time. Aristotle, even before Aristotle, but the guy that really started it, you've never heard of him, and he said there has to be a cause of the universe, and it had to have some sort of a beginning. Now, later on, they said, no, the universe is infinitely old, infinitely large, never had a beginning. It's always been here. Plato and Aristotle believed in an uncaused cause. They never really agreed on what this uncaused cause was like. They were kind of like Albert Einstein in his later days. They thought there was some supreme universal intellect that was behind it all, but they never could boil it down to God or gods or any kind of deity. Einstein, when asked about it, he said, I'm not an atheist, I believe in Spinoza's God. Anybody ever heard of Spinoza? He was a philosopher back in the mid to late 19th century. And his idea of God was he was what you would call a pantheist. Pan meaning wide, theist meaning believer in God. So he believed there was God everywhere. All of nature was an ongoing expedition of God, exposition of God, and that God was everywhere. Now, I don't think he was quite like the Hindus that believe specific things are God. Spinoza believed that there was just a God around, and everywhere you looked, there he was. but that he had no relationship with mankind whatsoever. He created them, and then he just kind of left them on their own, okay, like a deist would believe. But so we really don't know what Aristotle and Plato believed about this uncaused cause, but they did believe in some supreme being. Now, this was 300 years before Christ was born. They were talking about this. And I've already mentioned this, within the last 100 years, science has proven by observation and experiment that the universe had a beginning. And there's just adding mountains and mountains of information to that conclusion. Pretty much in the scientific community, there's no one who does not believe that the universe came into existence. The most recent stuff is what's called the cosmic background radiation, which they made a big expensive satellite and shot it up into deep space just to measure the background temperature of the universe, which was predicted by Einstein's equations. And guess what? What they actually measured matched his equations, just unbelievable, many decimal places. So Einstein's general relativity, his theory of general relativity, predicted this number, and the scientific, the satellite confirmed it. So I mean, that's almost spooky. So the first cause has got a lot of strength to it. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, they were talking about this 3,500 years ago, and 85 years ago we decided that, hey, there was a beginning. Now the objection comes with the word cause. What caused that beginning? The problem is, if the universe was caused, a skeptic would say, well, what caused the thing that caused the universe? If you believe in the principle of cause and effect, then the cause must have been caused. God, what caused God? And that's been their argument against the first caused argument. And it throws you into what's called an infinite regression. What caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the... I mean, you just keep on and on and on. And, but actually, there's an infinite regression is irrational. It does not exist. And many philosophers have talked about infinite regressions, but being a guy that's taken a lot of mathematics and been heavily involved in mathematics, you know, the idea of infinity has always been kind of comical to me, because infinity there's no such thing as infinity. Infinity is a mathematical concept. When you take a number and you divide it by 0, you get infinity. It's not a number. It's not anything you can use to do anything with. Okay. And so so there is no such thing as an actual infinity. And an infinite regression requires an actual infinity. And therefore, an infinite regression does not exist. So who caused the cause? Who created the creator? Who created the creator? And then who created the creator's creator? They love that argument, but it's an irrational argument. The creator must be eternal, with neither beginning nor end, and immaterial, not made of matter. So whoever created the universe cannot be like the universe, or else he would be bound by its laws, okay? He was outside. He had to have been outside the universe, because at one time there was no universe. We know that from the fact that there was a beginning. And Einstein drew this same, this is when Einstein, he's had a rough period of time around this time when at first he rejected the idea of a beginning. Thought his math was wrong, went back and fudged it. And then when they observed it, when Hubble actually observed that the universe was expanding, embarrassed Einstein. called it the biggest blunder of his career. He had to get rid of this fudge factor he put in there and admit that there was a beginning, and mainly because of the philosophical impact it had on his atheism. Because philosophically, if you have something begins, there had to be a beginner. Okay. For the universe to have come into existence without having been created, there's only one option. It had to have created itself. Now, think about that one for a second. Something self-creating. And actually, unfortunately, that's what these atheists in the scientific community are hanging their hat on. I'd hate to be in that position, to have to back up the idea of self-creation, that something could pop into existence from nothing. Now, any philosopher would tell you that self-creation is irrational. It can't be, because it violates the law of non-contradiction. Is that on here? Yeah. What do you know? Because to self-create, something has to exist and non-exist at the same time. Think about that. In order to self-create, it can't exist, but then it exists. That's a married bachelor, okay? It cannot happen. It violates the philosophical law of non-contradiction, but it does a lot more than that. It violates the law of physics, the principle of cause and effect, which is the foundation for the law of physics, and the laws of thermodynamics, which I know a whole lot about. Practiced them for 43 years. Sam did too. A lot of thermo in this that is violated by the idea that something can come from nothing. All of a sudden, from one instant there's nothing, the next instant there's all the energy and matter in the universe. Can't happen. It just cannot happen. But the question was God caused? Now, why wasn't God caused? How did God come about without violating the law of cause and effect? How did he get around the law of cause and effect? Well, John chapter 4, verse 24 tells us, God is a spirit, and those who worship him must do so in spirit and in truth. God is not material. Now, since we've been able to walk and go to church, we've been taught that God's a big grandfather that sits up in some big throne way off out on a cloud, right? I wish they'd revise that obviously wrong impression of God. God is a spirit. We don't know much about spirit scientifically. I'm kind of working on a theory, but it's still a ways away yet, about how a spirit can make something happen. How would you do that? How can a spirit make something happen? Anybody got an answer to that? We'll get you a Nobel Prize. Well, here's kind of the way it works. Scientists, I heard an atheist say one day, and he gave me a clue. Christians want you to believe that God just willed the universe into existence. How ridiculous a thought. And he was debating a guy, and I can't remember who the guy was that he was debating, but his opponent said, oh, it was Stephen Meyer, that's who it was. Stephen Meyer said, it happens all the time. And this Cambridge professor was just kind of set aback about this. He just made this statement about Christians want you to believe that God just willed the universe into existence. And Stephen Meyer says, it happens all the time. He said, this building, somebody had an idea. idea has no mass. It is not material, an idea, is it? Do y'all think an idea is something you can weigh or measure its temperature or measure its dimensions? An idea is not material, right, Grady? At least I don't think it is. But this building was an idea. It started with an idea, right? Somebody had an idea. You know, everything that we can put our hands on just about that's been manufactured started from somebody's idea. So from this non-material idea came this material building. Is that making sense to you guys? I mean, I'm getting some stares on this one. But I don't blame you, because it's really not something that's ever been worked out too well. But that, to me, is an illustration. God, a spirit, non-material, willed the universe into existence. He had the power to do it. He had the wherewithal to do it. But the idea of the universe started from something very non-material, a spirit. The first cause argument, if successful, establishes the existence of a creator that exists in eternity, not in time. A creator that supersedes the physical laws and is self-existent. Another thing about God is He does not conform to the physical space-time dimensions that we do. God is not subject to time. You know, you couldn't put an age on God. He's not subject to that. So He lives in God, the Spirit, lives in a completely different kind of an environment that we live in. No space, no dimensions. Spirit doesn't need any dimensions. No time as we know it. There may be some other form of time. It may be some other dimension that we don't even know about. One day we'll understand all that. Okay. Now, these arguments, the argument from the first cause argument does not rule out the God that we worship, or the God that we would be discussing. You know, most of the people in here believe in God. Now, you know, in a discussion like this, sometimes you may have some people in here that absolutely are atheist or agnostic, at least. So they don't have this intuitive feeling about God. They don't believe there's a God. So the argument from the first cause argument eliminates a lot of the gods that are found around them. And our God is still in play because we think He's a creator. So right there in the first 10 words of Scripture. And so, but I think this is a strong argument. I think it's a very strong argument, particularly since 100 years ago we found out that there actually was a beginning. I mean, that really puts some horsepower on this philosophical argument. You agreed? I mean, like I say, they've been discussing this for 2,500 years, and all of a sudden 185 years ago to be exact, which is within the lifetime of Janet's dad. He's still alive. He was born 10 years before it was just finally concluded. And Leanne's dad too, excuse me, Leanne. So I think that lends a very strong argument. We've had the ontological argument, which was kind of a tie. Not strong for God, did not rule out God. Then we have the argument, the first cause argument, which has actually some scientific knowledge to back it up. Now we're talking about the argument from design, and this is called the teleological argument. And here's what it says. The universe and the earth are extremely well suited for life. Would you agree? The universe and the earth are well suited for life. I mean, we could have 10 times the solar radiation that we have, and life wouldn't exist on the Earth. So not only the Earth is well suited for life, but the cosmos is well suited for life, because we're not bathed in serious radiation all the time. So don't just think about the Earth, think about the entire universe. Particularly for human life, we're called complex life. Some of us are more complex than others, but anyway, we're called complex life, okay? And anytime you hear me talk about complex life, I'm talking about cows and horses and humans and not bacteria, okay? Even though bacteria are extremely complex, more than anything we've ever witnessed, okay? But anyway, it's just a way to talk. So what are the characteristics of design? Well, I didn't finish my statement. The life itself is complex and exhibits the characteristics of design. So not only is the Earth and the universe complex, but we are, you know, you look at a cell under an electron microscope and you see a lot of stuff going on. And we're going to talk about that before we're through, not tonight, but later on. Design displays order, complexity, purpose, and functionality. One of the things I saw just the other day was an electron microscope picture of a mica crystal. Mica is a kind of a glass, natural glass. And it was absolutely perfect. It looked like it had been machined in a machine shop, perfect cube. Now that's order, but that's not complexity. It has order, but it does not have any complexity. It's just a cube. Now, if you looked at an electron microscope of mica and saw that the cubes were aligned in a perfect half offset, like you'd build a cinder block wall, and was built up high and had arches and windows and all that kind of stuff in it, then you'd say, hey, that's complex. But all you got is a cube. It's order. There's order to it, but there's no complexity to it. And that's one of the characteristics of design. Okay. Now here's something that's extremely important to remember. Design is inherently the result of intelligence. Inherently. No one can look at something complex and ever say it happened randomly, except, of course, the evolutionists who think we all happen randomly. Science has identified many hundreds of cosmological relationships that are necessary for the development and sustaining of complex life. The universe is so fine-tuned that a single one of these attributes, and there's hundreds of these things, and when we're going to talk about the anthropic principle. Anybody ever heard of the anthropic principle? Anthro means man. Anthropic principle means associated with man, okay? Hundreds of these things that have to be right. If the earth were bigger than it is, we couldn't live because we'd weigh 1,000 pounds. If the orbit of the earth was elliptical instead of perfectly round, which is very unusual in the universe, we'd be freezing to death in, I mean, and I'm not talking about 30 degrees, I'm talking about minus 200 degrees in January and 1,100 degrees in July. I mean, we couldn't make it doing that. But in the future, it's been given a name, the anthropic principle. You'll definitely want to be here when we talk about it, because it's a lot of scientists who are Christians believe that the only argument you need to prove God exists is the anthropic principle. They say that is proof of God. We'll talk about it. Now, possibly the most compelling case for design is a living cell. Not only because it's complex, it's got chemical plants, power plants, it's got computers in it, it's just got hundreds of different things that allow it to do what it does, create proteins, which are extremely complex molecules. I used to make my living making polymers, and it would take a chemical plant that would cover 13 acres to make polyethylene. And yet every cell in your body makes proteins like, which is a polymer, a different kind of a polymer, just like no big deal. Not only is a cell extremely complex, there's enough information in every cell in your body, and between looking around at you guys, it's probably ranges from 50 trillion cells to 100 trillion cells. And every one of those cells is all that information. Billions of pieces of information in every single cell. I mean, when we talk about that, y'all don't wear socks that night because they'll be blown completely off of you. Of course, our friends, the evolutionists, say that all just kind of fell together. You know, that all kind of happened randomly. And we know that information comes from intellect as well. The most prominent objection against the argument from design is neo-Darwinian evolution, Darwin's theory. All this stuff happened pretty much randomly, even though the mathematics of that are just outrageous. Darwin's theory asserts that the life adapted to fit the environment rather than the other way around. Complex organisms gradually evolved over time, over long periods of time. And we're going to see just how long of a time they really had. The truth is, it didn't have much time. Life appeared on Earth like that. Natural selection is what he calls it. Now, evolutionists have yet to be able to explain how the conditions favorable for evolution actually came about. No good explanation of how life originated. Even Richard Dawkins will say, well, we just don't know, which is unusual coming from him because I think he thinks he knows everything. As we will discover later, the evolutionists have a lot of problems with their theory. You can read On the Origin of Species, which I've read, and it's actually a pretty interesting book. And Darwin himself points out all these arguments. You never hear that on television. I mean, Darwin says, man, if this and this and this if we don't find the answers to these problems, then my theory is not worth the paper it's written on. So, and guess what? We haven't found them. Another objection is the multiverse or many worlds. How many of you have heard about the theory of multiverse, the multiverse theory? Okay. If you have one chance and a number with 250 zeros behind it, which is a number that cannot be described in human language, how do you defeat those poor odds? Well, you create a number of universes with more than 250 zeros, okay? If you were buying a lottery ticket and they told you that the chances of winning this were 1 in 250 million, I'd say, hey, that's cool. I'll just buy 250 million lottery tickets. You know, so that's how the multiverse thing started. They bought 250 million lottery tickets, you know. They just invented all these universes. And of course, none of this is testable. It's impossible to test the existence of another universe. If you can do that, let me know and we'll share the Nobel Prize. But it can't be done. I think the argument from design is a knock-down dead argument in favor of God. I mean, I cannot see it being defeated by anybody. Even Anthony Flew, I don't know if any of you ever heard of Anthony Flew, but anybody heard of Richard Dawkins? All right, he's the world's most famous atheist. Well, the guy that was the world's most famous atheist before Richard Dawkins was a guy named Anthony Flew. Well, look what it says about Anthony Flew up there. He published a book that was called There Is a God, because he showed up at a debate and told everybody, I'm going to have to get on the other side of the table. I believe there's a God. I mean, it just floored everybody. It'd be like Billy Graham saying, I'm now an atheist. I mean, it was that kind of a thing. And the reason was an argument from design. he finally said, I can't be intellectually honest and continue to say that this thing is not point to a creator. Okay, Occam's razor. Anybody ever heard of Occam's razor? It's not something you shave with. Occam's razor is a philosophical idea that if you have an explanation, use the one that seems most likely. The example I use is if you lived on a cattle ranch in Texas and you were awakened by 100 hoofbeats going by your window, you wouldn't conclude it was a herd of zebras. That's Occam's razor. Okay, well, that's what the atheists are doing regarding this argument from design. They say, well, couldn't have been a God, it had to be random choice, something random. Richard Dawkins says, biology, now listen to this is Richard Dawkins. Biology is the study of complex things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. I don't get it. He's an atheist, and yet he's saying that's what biology is. It's the study of things that look like they were designed. That's a violation of Occam's razor. One of my favorite philosophers says, why make up billions of other universes when a single supernatural God will do the trick? Okay. Now, if the argument from design is successful, it describes a God, a perfect God, who created the universe and all that exists therein for the sole purpose of bringing about human life on earth. He not only created a universe, he went to the 120th decimal place to make it so that we could live in it. You got it? It's just not, hey, created this big, hot, cold, whatever it is, universe. Here's this little planet sitting right in between two of the spiral arms of the Milky Way, right between them, because if it was close to either one of them, we couldn't live. The orbit would become too elliptical. There'd be too much influence by nearby stars. Nearest star to us, 4.43 light years away. 25 trillion miles. Alpha Centauri Proxima. That's the nearest star to us, 20 trillion miles away, so it has no influence on us. The moral argument. Everybody ever heard of C.S. Lewis, famous Christian philosopher and writer? C.S. Lewis was an atheist for many years, an atheist, very intellectual, probably the smartest guy I ever heard talk. This moral argument, and also the argument from design, converted him to a Christian. And all of a sudden, he's the greatest Christian you ever heard. Now, the moral argument proposes that because moral requirements exist that are not material, they must have come from some source other than human. In other words, how could humans write these moral things? Particularly if we evolved. If we evolved, which is the argument against the moral argument, we would be just like the animals, wouldn't we? I mean, one animal, a lion catches a gazelle and eats it, so what? I've never seen a lion fret over that. I never saw a monkey watch it and fret over it. That's just nature. That's the way we would be if we lived in a natural world. Right, Sam? We wouldn't. Or I'd take, like I said over lunch the other day, I'd pull out my pistol and shoot Sam right between the eyes, and Ed would say, hey, nice shot. That's what we're talking about here. There is something inside of us that rejects that kind of thinking. And it has nothing to do with being legal or anything else, because as we all know, living in the United States, there's a lot of things that are legal, very legal, that are immoral. Pornography, all kinds of stuff like that. Adultery is even legal. Now, we have to conclude from what we know about morality that it must come from some higher authority. Man couldn't have cooked this up. Particularly, man couldn't have embedded it in our brains to where it's automatic. You know, even Hitler had a moral, he had a little guy sitting on his shoulder saying, that's not good. But he ignored, had a sick mind, him and Stalin and some of the other guys. Okay, the skeptical objection. I've already gotten ahead on this one. That's when you say, well, there's no such thing as morality anyway. That's when you pick up the gun, shoot Sam, and Ed says, nice shot. You know, it never occurs to us that there's anything morally wrong with that. We know without a PhD in philosophy that that's not true. That's simply wrong. So that objection just carries no weight whatsoever. And a more recent complaint has to do with evolution. And some would say, well, we evolved this morality because we discovered years ago that if you're moral and you act right and you love and share and all that sort of stuff, that improves your chances of survival. Well, that goes completely against the theory of evolution. Evolution doesn't say anything like that. Evolution is based on the survival of the fittest. It's not selflessness that makes you survive, it's selfishness, not selflessness, selfishness that makes you there's no way you can twist evolution to come up with that kind of a conclusion, that, oh, we're moral because we found it to be beneficial. Baloney, that does not work at all. Pure desperation on the part of who makes that claim. Selfish are more likely to survive in the evolutionary world. Richard Dawkins will not make an argument against that. In fact, he wrote a book that said just the opposite. Now, the Apostle Paul writes, even the Gentiles who do not have God's written law, in other words, they don't go along with the book of the law, show that they know His law when they instinctively obey it even without having heard it. In other words, they don't have to read the books of the law to act right. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their heart. So God understands all this. He put it in the Scripture, that this moral law is written into the hearts of man. I believe that. I mean, and I'm sure all of us would have little differences of opinion about morality in certain areas, but we all have a moral bent. We're all guided to some extent by morals. Now, let me get through this quickly because we've got about 10 minutes. Now, if you combine the weight of all of these philosophical arguments, ontological argument, which is not real strong, but God could be necessary if we conclude that He actually created the universe. He becomes necessary. The first cause argument. We know there's a beginning. Science tells us that. We don't have to have Aristotle to tell us that. You know, science tells us that. Design. That's so obvious to all of us that it's laughable to think that all of this could have happened by random chance. And then morals. We can test that in our own lives, in our own minds. And the cumulative effect of all of this is that there must be some God in this universe that created it for us, placed a moral restriction upon His creation. Now, who does that sound like to you? Does that sound like a Hindu God? Does that sound like any other God that you've ever read about or heard about? To me, it's pretty simple that that only points to one God that we know about. The biggest objection that the atheists have and the debaters that don't accept this is what's called the problem of evil. If God is an omniscient, omnipresent, benevolent God, why does He allow so much evil in the world? I mean, there couldn't be a God and you look out what's happening in this world. Look what's happening in the Middle East. People cutting each other's heads off, you know, people slaughtering people because they think differently than they do. Couldn't be a God if a world like that exists. In the 20th century, over 200 million people killed as a result of World War I and World War II. 200 million people. You know, the United States only had 200 million people in it at the end of World War II. That would be like erasing the entire population of the United States. So how could a God allow that? How could a benevolent God that, you know, poking at the Christians allow that? I've heard it said, this is fun here, I heard it said that God would never send a person to hell. Let's turn that around a bit. If this were in a, you know, first of all, why would God not punish someone who disobeyed His commandments, who refused to accept Him as God? Why would He just not do that? I mean, if you brought that to a human court of law and the guy made his plea, judge, you can't be a benevolent judge and send me to the gas chamber, or I don't guess they use the whatever, firing squad. They still use the firing squad? Anyway. No human court would do this. I mean, if you were violated the law, you would be punished. You know what that's called? It's called justice. So God doesn't send anybody to hell. He gives them all sorts of opportunities to escape that problem, and people choose, just like the criminal chose to break the law. He has to face the result of that. Now, the problem of evil. There are about 3 or 4 problems, and I'll just go through them real quickly. The free will defense. All right. God created us with free will. Would you agree with that? Anybody in here feel like a robot? You feel like you're programmed to do everything? If that's true, I wish, I might wish that God had programmed me to do some things I don't know how to do. But atheists believe that. In fact, Albert Einstein believed that it was called determinism. He thought that everything he did was guided by the physical laws. It's ridiculous. I can't understand it. So God gives men free will to do what they want. Guess what they do? They sin. That's not God sinning. That's the man making, because in order for a creation man to love God, his creator, he has to be able to choose yes or no, right? I mean, it wouldn't be love if he was forced to love you, right? Does that make any sense at all? God created us with free will so we could choose to love him or not to. So one of the unpleasant side effects of that is that he chooses to commit crimes and do sins and do all kinds of bad things, kill each other, 250 million people in 1 century. But you can't lay that at the feet of God, because if you read the scripture throughout, from cover to cover, it talks about this. The laws, first 5 books of the Bible just deal with the laws and these sanctions and restraints on this evil behavior. So you really can't, blame a lot of the evil on people. It's on their free will. But what about things that aren't created by man, like natural disasters? No free will involved there. A hurricane comes up, hits a town, kills 200 people. Well, these are times that God allows. Now, people say, well, he could have stopped it. Why didn't he? Well, I don't know. But God it's very infrequent that God gets in the middle of the goings-on in this earth like that. at least where we could actually measure that. You know, well, maybe that hurricane could have gone up and hit New York. That'd been a lot better than hitting Mobile, right? You know, there's a lot of worse people up there. I mean, I don't know how you make that argument, but anyway, hard times are times when Christians are allowed to grow. Have you ever learned anything worthwhile when everything was just going great? You know, you don't learn anything. You learn through trials and tribulations and even danger. That's when people mature and learn. And people who have lived in a life where they've never been tested or come face to face with any kind of, they don't know anything. I mean, they never mature. But you take somebody that's been through trials and tribulations and have learned to go and seek God's help and the help of other people. That also gives us an opportunity to go help somebody in these times. You ever noticed that in a hurricane, it brings out the best of people? I mean, people helping and literally risking their lives for people they don't even know. So God allows that. But what about a young mother that's got 2 young kids and dies of cancer? What about and I mean, Janet and I have been all over these kind of examples. A husband gets up in the morning, goes to work, killed on the way to work in a car wreck. There's no way you can justify that. I mean, right? Well, those are times when God draws His people near to Him. We've, in our family, we've had just recently 2 young women in the last few years. Very young, cancer, died, 2 young children. I'm telling you, they went out praising God. Philosophical arguments speak of a God that's necessary, perfect, a God who created the universe, a God who prepared it for human habitation, a God who has written His law into the hearts of mankind, the moral law, a God who has given us a choice to accept Him or reject Him. That's what this argument tonight I've concluded, right? All right, I have a quiz question for you. Where do you find a God like that? Anybody of you ever heard of a God just like that? Where would you find out about Him?
In the Scriptures.
In the Scriptures. So the philosophical arguments that have been going on for 2,500 years about God, all they do to me is just absolutely confirm that this God that they're seeking to identify resides, at least the knowledge of Him resides in what we call the Scriptures.